Prime Minister, Merry Christmas. Thanks for joining us.
Merry Christmas to you.
What are your reflections on this year? There have been some highs and lows as there are over the year.
Yes.
Parliamentary protests.
Yeah.
Low light, but New Zealand has reached a new equilibrium with COVID.
Yes. No, that really does sum it up. I mean, it has been a challenging year. And in part, just as you've reflected, for many it will feel like it was much longer ago even that we had those parliamentary protests. And just a few days ago, I actually looked up to remind myself, where were we at the beginning of December in 2021? We were just going into the traffic light system. We still had a regional border. That in part just reminds me and reminds us how much people have been through, but also how far we've come. Politics, though, is all about dealing with challenges. It's all about the problems that we have as a nation and what we're doing to fix them. So it's not unusual, of course, for that to be the focus of a government, but it is fair to say there have been some more unexpected ones than you'd usually see.
Looked at some of the polling around the Parliament protest, and the polling was very supportive of the actions the government took in relation to that protest. But looking back at it now, people in that protest and part of that wider movement, they are frightened and scared. I see some really tragic news about that recently. Is there a role for the Prime Minister, for yourself, in healing those wounds?
Yeah. I would say yes. I think because actually, I think it's a Prime Minister's job or a leader's job at any given time to address where there are issues, where there is, whether it's misinformation, whether or not it's anxiety about issues. That's always your job. I think what's challenging, perhaps in these times, is that even some of those best efforts, sometimes it's a difficult environment in which to do that. When I think about even through, for instance, COVID, one of the issues was, vaccine hesitancy or concerns there. We were very careful to make sure that we were always talking about having conversations with people about those issues and trying to gently move through it. That, however, unfortunately didn't stop it becoming for a small group, quite a fractious issue.
Do you have a message for them?
That the same one I probably always had. I've always believed that regardless of the position, people's intentions have always been right. It's always been about how do we best look after people. But those who may have very strong feelings about, for instance, vaccines, that might be their starting point, but that was ours too. We always were focused on how do we best look after people. So let's start from the point that we've shared and find ways that where we won't agree to accept that, just to accept that we don't, but trying to do it in such a way that doesn't spill over into the level of fracture that we've seen.
No,
which is still a small group. Yeah.
Indeed, and very small. On issues, the most recent Ipsos issues polling has Labour behind on a lot of key issues like inflation, housing, crime, economy, and price of fuel. How does Labour reset the narrative on that in election year?
Over the course of 2023, I know that there will be, and leading into, there will and is some anxiety around globally the economic shock that we're seeing and the impact it will have on New Zealand. Now, my message here is very clear. Despite the unknowns, we know enough to know that actually New Zealand is well placed and we will get through, and we will get through better than most. But one of the reasons for that is because of how we as a Labour government have set ourselves up to get through this next phase. We've kept debt down, unemployment is low. We have gone from a period where we've supported people through COVID to now bringing our spending back to get us through this next wave. Our job is to keep demonstrating to people that we've got our eye focused on the most important things right now, our economic recovery and supporting people through it.
On tax, for instance, we've got a tax take which is a percentage of GDP is at a relatively high level. Obviously, you don't want tax cuts for high-income people, but people are paying quite a lot of tax. Is Labour open to looking at those tax rates in the election?
Well, here I would say that actually we tend to have, a bit of a view that that easing the pressure is solely about some of those more blanket moves that you can make. Now, here, of course, for us, we've said these actually matters of timing matter. Right now, what the National Party have proposed, billions of dollars worth of tax cuts, would be inflationary, would make some of those issues we're experiencing worse. We've said using things like a tax credit system, which does give support out to families, 60% of each. It's a greater rate, so we can provide more support, but more targeted and less inflationary. So
is that what you're looking at as an election policy, is using the tax credit system to offer income relief to people?
Well, my position has been that right here and now, it can't just be about what will you do come the election. Our job as government is to do something now, and that is where we have focused. So we've had the family tax credit increase. The IMF said one of the most important things governments can do right now is to help people with, for instance, targeted initiatives like childcare. We've done that as well. Significant increases in subsidies that will come in short order. And at the same time, fuel, doing what we can on food prices. Always looking to ease the problem without making it worse.
And I think the Working for Families review has been done. Carmel Sepuloni's leading that work. I think it's coming to Cabinet soon. So is Working for Families, that I think 55% of families receive some form of assistance through it. Is that really where Labor is thinking, right, these people are really at the heart of the inflation pain? We have
already demonstrated that. And so, on the question of tax, we said, look, we'll of course work through a tax policy for the election. But when you're in government, your job is to do something in the here and now. The tax proposals we've seen the National Party would give less to those who need it the most and would be inflationary. We have used tools like, for instance, Working for Families to reach a significant proportion of those families, but at a greater value.
And you mentioned timing earlier, timing regarding inflation and not wanting to throw fuel on the fire for immediate tax cuts. So would you perhaps go to the election saying, look, here is a tax policy, but perhaps trigger it once this inflation wave is abated somewhat? Obviously I won't announce policies here. No, please do.
I see the invitation is being made, but I've said that timing does matter. It does matter because we don't want to do anything that makes it worse. We recognise the need to support people. We recognise the need particularly for our low and middle income earners, and that's what we're doing. But of course, as it stands for future policy, that's obviously down the track. Here and now, though, we need to make sure we're making those moves, and we are. And we will keep doing that on a rolling basis as well.
And Mark Mitchell, the MP.
I'm familiar with Mark Mitchell.
We have many in our office.
I see, right. Fair.
Has mentioned Labor's prison reduction target, reducing the prison muster by 30% over the next 15 years as a problem. Is that something Labor is still committed to and willing to campaign on during the election?
Here I would say that your prison population is a reflection of whether or not you're seeing victimisation and reoffending. Surely we can all agree that we want to decrease that. So to try and use that as an example of saying to somehow that you're wanting to reduce the level of responsibility people take for crime is wrong. It is wrong. It is all about reducing the number of victims and reducing the number of people who go back to prison because they have reoffended. That's what those targets are about.
Right. And you're keen to divorce that part of the judicial system, I suppose, corrections from Labor's refreshed approach to law and order and crime?
Well, the challenge that I would make is that we have always been a party focused on making sure that we have fewer people who become victims. And so this argument that, to be honest, I think is just very old school politics. This soft on crime, tough on crime. Well, actually, you will not find a politician who thinks that crime is good for society or wants to see increases in victimisation. No one does. The debates we have are what are the most successful ways to stop harm in our communities. Now, the challenge that I always throw back to anyone who uses these soft on crime slogans is show me where we have reduced the sentences for any of the crimes that we are seeing being committed. We have not. What we have done is actually increase the number of police, increased police resourcing. We've also brought in greater penalties and a range of different tools for gangs because we know that's a problem. And for instance, really particularly focused on firearms and those things which make us unsafe. So I think we need, surely there's a time we can get past the slogans and actually talk about the fact that these are tough, complex issues But we, rather than just having opposition, actually have solutions.
We talk a lot about inflation and economy, talk a lot about crime, talk a lot about welfare. What's a policy area or portfolio that New Zealanders don't talk about, aren't talking about a lot right now, that you think maybe is worthy of barbecue chat over the summer?
Well, actually, I think for the most part, New Zealanders, you hear that mixture of we need to make sure we're addressing the short term but also the long term. And I think New Zealand's actually quite good at being very mindful of that. Even through COVID, it was a challenge right in front of us, but we were mindful of the long-term impacts on child poverty. We're mindful of the long-term impacts of large job loss. And so I'd like to think as a government we've always been focused on both. One thing that I think is increasingly being talked about because of the magnitude of the problem is climate change. You perhaps don't as often hear the direct connection between the severe weather events that we see, which are top of mind, and actually the long-term impacts. But it is an issue that we have to tackle as a nation. My disappointment is, as much as you see cross-party support for the most part on the issue, you don't necessarily see ideas coming through on all sides.
Indeed. And on that, actually, just sort of to wrap up, I suppose when you look at the numbers over the summer, many barbecue conversations might be about looking at Christopher Luxon and the National Party and thinking, I might give them a go. This is for the first time in many years. National is in a position where people might be thinking that.
Well, actually, in 2019, we were 8 points behind at this time of year. So actually, I think that just demonstrates how much movement you see, how much change you see.
Indeed, but kind of just on that issue, what would be your message to New Zealanders who are thinking that? Why shouldn't they think that, and why should they stick with you?
I think of all the things that we have been through over the past 5 years. We have demonstrated that when a challenge comes our way, we will be singularly focused on it. And with a team now that has huge experience and also our record, when I look at the economic situation that we are facing, we are already better placed than most because we got debt down, because we are bringing spending down, but because we also looked after people through those tough times, and that is what we will keep doing. We have the experience and the plan to do it. You can't oppose your way through a crisis. You have to have ideas and a plan, and that's exactly what we've done.
Prime Minister, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
I hope you don't talk about politics.
I hope for everyone's sake there's a little less of it.
Indeed. Merry Christmas. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Wishing everyone a very Merry Christmas and a happy, joyous New Year.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. To stay up to date with all the latest news from the New Zealand Herald, click the subscribe button below or check out one of the videos here, and head over to nzherald.co.nz for more details on these stories and more.